What's up, All-Stars? Welcome to the School of Ireland. Today you're in for a real treat because you'll get to hear from Towson University professor Professor Baetjer, who is the author of Free Our Markets, A Citizen's Guide to Essential Economics. First off, let me tell you that this is an absolutely fantastic book. I highly recommend reading it. In fact, this book is so good that it should go on your reading list of must-read books before you die. Overall, this was a really fun interview in that I was able to push Professor Baetjer with questions that many critics of free market capitalism like to ask, including questions like, what happens when impoverished individuals in a free market can't afford housing or medical goods? Or why is it better, as Professor Baetjer argues, to remove governmental regulations when there are, as others may argue, great regulations out there like building codes that keep the house from falling on your head? Please note, these questions hit him cold turkey. He wasn't prepped ahead of time. With that said, I'll let you be the judge on how well he answered them. Just make sure to share your thoughts in the comments below. Enjoy. Professor Baetjer, thank you so much for joining me today. I can't tell you how excited I am to talk with you.
Well, maybe you're more excited than is justified.
To give a little background to the audience, in addition to teaching psychology, one of the courses that I occasionally teach is AP Economics. And a few years ago, I stumbled upon a YouTube video called What If There Were No Prices? And in that video, there's a really cool thought experiment that examines the differences between centrally planned command economies and free markets. And as it turns out, you're the narrator of that video. So when I started doing interviews on my channel, I was like, I want to talk to that guy. So here you are. I am really excited. Thank you for joining me. It's a real privilege.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate being asked.
So in addition to your YouTube fame, at least among econ teachers, you have a book called Free Our Markets, A Citizen's Guide to Essential Economics, which I'll link in the description below. Today, I want to dive into your book a bit. And unlike some works where you have to go kind of digging for the thesis, your title kind of says it all. It gets straight to the point. So my first question is, and we'll start small, what is a free market?
What is a free market? It's really a set of legal institutions, or it's what arises out of a set of legal institutions. So the legal institutions would be the protection of private property, the legitimacy of private ownership. So private ownership and freedom of exchange. If the law will protect people's rightfully gained and owned property and allow them to exchange their property rights as they wish, with very few limitations on that. Then, because people have this propensity to truck, barter, and exchange, as Adam Smith said, they will make exchanges, and they'll form companies and proprietorships and societies, or in the sense of clubs and so on. And they'll organize in different ways and interact voluntarily and exchange with one another. And that activity is a free market. I don't know that I've ever been asked that way before, Richard, but I think that's a pretty decent answer. A free market is what is the human activity, exchange activity, interaction among people whose property is protected and who are free to make exchanges as they see fit, as long as others are agreeable.
Now, let's go a little bit bigger. And I know you wrote a whole book on it, and you don't have time to summarize the whole book, but why is it important to free our markets?
Our markets, meaning the markets that the human race has now, and we do have in the United States. My publisher, a wonderful guy named Barry Brownstein, came up with that. He might be a good person for you to interview. he came up with that title. I love the title because it implies that what we have in the United States now and in the whole world is not really free markets. Even the most free market places don't have completely free markets, or markets that are maximum as free as is feasible. And I don't know where I would draw the limit to that. But in the United States, for example, schooling is about 88% government dominated. I think 80 some percent of all American school children go to schools that are provided by the government rather than the market. We have Social Security, which is a government retirement project. We've got the Department of Agriculture, which meddles in what farmers do. We have all kinds of interference with freedom of exchange. A lot of it is well-intended, and maybe some of it is even worthwhile and good on net, though I'm skeptical of that. What the book is arguing is that we should really free our markets. We should be more free than we are now, even in the United States. We have a mixed economy, and we ought to have a free economy.
In your book, you say market prices are necessary to allow societies to function. Without market prices, not just any prices set arbitrarily, but prices determined in free exchange, human society would regress to savagery because we would not know what to do to use our scarce resources sensibly. Can you extrapolate on this? What do you mean by this?
Yeah, this is an idea that comes from the great economist Ludwig von Mises, who is an eminent scholar in the so-called Austrian school that I'm trained in. Oh boy, there's so much in that, Richard. And an article I would recommend to your listeners that presents this as well as anyone ever has is called The Use of Knowledge in Society. It's by 1974 Nobel Prize winner Friedrich Hayek. And without prices, we would regress to savagery. The reason is that any individual person's knowledge is necessarily very, very limited. You and I, for example, probably couldn't grow our own food, make our own clothing, build our own shelters. We rely on others. We're specialists that have special knowledge in that. So the knowledge that people need to get the good things that make for a happy and prosperous life is dispersed all over the world. I start all my courses with emphasizing this lesson with Leonard Read's wonderful short piece, I Pencil, which I recommend to your listeners. He points out that the knowledge needed to make pencils, the chemistry, the metallurgy, the logging skills, is spread out all over, literally all over the world. And so we couldn't really even have a pencil without the cooperation of thousands and millions of other people. But each of us knows so little that we don't really know how to. We need some way to learn what other people are doing and what they want so that our actions can be coordinated with their actions. And that challenge is beyond any central planners, because any central planners are going to be humans, and humans are limited in what they can know. And central planners can't get the knowledge they need to plan well. So what tells all of us what we should be producing with our skills that satisfy what other people want? And in what quantities? And when should we switch from one variety to another? And the claim is that market prices do that, because market prices grow out of the bidding and asking, the buying and selling of each individual person in the economy. And when, for example, what would be a good example today? Space on shipping containers that are actually going to go around the world now, given the restraints on shipping. Undoubtedly, the price of those of space in shipping containers that are really going to be going somewhere is high now, because people need to ship goods with the COVID and the restrictions on workers. There's not as much shipping as there has been in the past. And so we want the goods that are most important to be shipped to be the ones that get on those containers. And the people who, in their own judgment, their own experience, believe they have something that's really valuable to people are going to be willing to bid more. And so the space on the shipping containers then would go to the people who have the goods that others want the most. And so the prices of all sorts of goods and services are determined in this way by the interplay of people in the economy. And those prices signal to us the relative value of and the costs of these goods and services. And it's the prices. Another term I like from this is from Alex Tabarrok and Tyler Cowan of Marginal Revolution University, which I recommend to your listeners. They say a price is a signal wrapped up in an incentive. It's a wonderful term. And so a price is a signal of how more or less urgently needed are the different chemicals and paints and materials and fabrics and so on that we use to support and enrich our lives. And without prices on them, we wouldn't know which ones to produce in greater and lesser quantity. And also we wouldn't know which goods we shouldn't use because other people value them more. That would be the case if the price is higher than we're really willing to pay. Somebody else is willing to pay a higher price. That means that she sees some higher valued use for it. So we should leave it to her. And prices do this wonderful communicating. And if we didn't have them, we'd have to rely on central planners in all their terrible limitations. And that would be bad. Look at the old Soviet Union and the lines people stayed in for hours and the low standard of living. So market prices, freely formed market prices, are necessary to human well-being because they communicate the real value and costs of goods and services at any particular time.
I feel like critics of free markets, critics of prices and capitalism like to point out that some people get priced out of the markets in regards to things like housing, medicine, and expensive surgeries. As a proponent of free markets, how would you respond to these criticisms?
Well, there are two senses, perhaps, of being priced out of the market. In one sense, that could mean, well, I can pay for this item if I had to, but I'm not willing to pay that high a price. That's the market working as it should, because it's through that kind of thought process that goods and services are allocated to those who really value them the most. The other sense of it is that you can imagine a person who very much urgently wants some good like food or shelter and simply doesn't have enough money to pay for it. The way I respond to that is that in the second case, when people truly don't have enough money to pay for the necessities of life, you and I ought to be kind and generous enough to give them what they need and help them out. But we should not interfere with the market process, which tends to provide goods and services and food and shelter to people at ever lower costs, lower prices over time. Things do tend to get cheaper in terms of the amount of hours, work hours we have to put in to afford them. And so this wonderful market process puts goods and services out there at whatever is the going market price. The tendency is for going market prices in real terms rather than nominal dollar terms to decrease steadily over time. That's a wonderful thing that helps poor people more than you and me, Richard. You and I are we're fortunate to be Americans. In 2022, we're pretty well off. But poor people, they need the creativity of the market process, the way the market process tends to drive down prices. Now, of course, at any time, there are going to be people who just can't pay the going market prices. Well, that's why we need human generosity, human consideration to look out for such people. It's the role of nonprofits and churches and so on, and that's the way it ought to be taken care of, not by interfering with the economic process that makes goods available in the first place. So while some people think that's that question is a showstopper, I think it's an easy one.
Well, let's dive down that route a little bit further. What if the government comes in and says, hey, here's this life-saving medicine that a lot of people need. You, medicine making company, have to make it cheaper. What happens next in the long run?
They have to make it cheaper, or they have to price it lower?
Excuse me, price it lower. Price it lower.
Price it lower. Well, it could be that if they're told to price it low enough that they can't afford to make it, or they won't earn any profits from it to invest in subsequent research and development for more medicines later. You never want to interfere with the price system. Now, if we're in a situation where there are important medicines that people can't afford, that some people can't afford, and if you have confidence in government bureaucrats and so on to make good decisions there, which is another question entirely. Let's pause it for a moment. Let's stipulate that the government officials we're thinking about here are really concerned about the well-being of others rather than their careers and so on.
Okay. It's a hard assumption to make, but we'll do it.
Yeah. So then if they want to get medicine to poor people, they should just give them a voucher. They should subsidize. They say, here's the price of the medicine. Now you can afford it. Now there's a really interesting piece of this. This comes from John Cochran of the University of Chicago. He says that if you're going to do something like that, you also don't want to tell the people that they have to spend it on the medicine. In other words, if the course of medicine that they need is $5,000, you give them $5,000 and let them spend it how they want. Because they might actually believe that something else other than medicine is going to be the best use of that $5,000. You do it that way, you can have the government take care of poor people, and you don't interfere with this essential communication through the price system. Is that clear?
Yeah. In your video, what if there were no prices? Which everyone should just go watch right now. I'll put the link to that as well as iPencil and whatever else we talked about in the description down below.
I just watched it, Richard. Let me interrupt.
Yeah.
I wrote the script and narrated it, and I'm very proud of it and pleased with it. But I'm also just immensely grateful to Thomas Kay, the artist who did the visuals for it. I've never met him. He's in Denmark, somewhere in Scandinavia. And didn't you think that the video was brilliant?
Oh, it was outstanding. The narration and the story, and as well as the animation, was mind blowing. It was great.
Yeah, the animation. That's right. Yeah. Okay. So anyhow, where were we?
Yeah, I was just saying everybody should go watch it and then come back here so we can pick up the conversation. But in your video, you talk about the knowledge problem. Do you mind?
The knowledge problem of central planning.
Yes. Do you mind just giving a brief explanation of that real quick?
We touched on that already. Yeah. The knowledge problem of central planning is that would-be central planners cannot possibly know all they need to know to plan effectively. It's the idea that's brought out in iPencil. Every person in the whole economy has just a tiny infinitesimal bit of knowledge. And in order to work effectively in a creative human society, they've got to take advantage of the knowledge of others. Central planners, well, the knowledge, that term, the knowledge problem, comes from my teacher in grad school, a wonderful guy, sadly now deceased, named Don Lavoie. I think he coined that term, the knowledge problem. And the knowledge problem is that in the absence of prices, which communicate so much knowledge, a price is a signal wrapped up in an incentive. In the absence of those signals, it's just impossible to determine the best way to produce things. And so communism, socialism, properly understood forms of society that don't take advantage of money prices formed on a market, they can't know how to produce efficiently. And so there'll be terrible, terrible waste. That's the knowledge problem of central planning. In the absence of market prices, which sort of combine all this knowledge from millions of people, it's impossible for people to know the least expensive, the least costly way to produce things. And so therefore we would waste our resources.
So here's a devil's advocate question to follow up on this knowledge problem of central planning. Keith C. commented on the YouTube video and said, for one thing, the information gap or the knowledge problem isn't solved entirely by a price system either. When you buy a product, you are not aware of all the externalities that might be involved. For instance, environmentally unfriendly practices such as pollution might reduce cost of goods, but also cause harm that the consumer doesn't factor in to their decision. A farm might use pesticide to make cheaper or better products and in turn become more profitable, but the runoff also causes harm to someone else or the environment in general. The impact of these sorts of things are difficult to assess as a consumer, but can be studied and remedied by a central planning entity via regulations.
All right, I was with you all the way. I'm with you and in complete agreement all the way to that point that these things can be studied and remedied. How did he finish it? Remedied how?
Yeah. He said all these externalities can be studied and remedied by a central planning entity via regulations.
They can certainly be studied. Whether or not they can be remedied is a totally different question. How would the argument is important, valid kind of argument. That's the argument about externalities. Certainly there are externalities because it is impossible both for consumers and producers to take advantage, to take account of external costs, harms to bystanders that they can't really even observe. Certainly there are such things, and this is an inefficiency in the market process, absolutely. What do we do about it? Who are the guys in Washington now? We've got Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi, and I don't pay too much attention to Joe Schumer, right? We've got are you going to let those guys and their kind determine it? Now you can say, no, we don't do that. We have the experts in the Environmental Protection Agency. Well, you can hope that they'll study things well and make good judgments about how to remedy externalities. And perhaps in some of the more obvious ones, it is possible to improve what would be the outcome in a pure market. But I'm very skeptical of the motivation and even the knowledge of governments. Maybe I should let it go right there. So in answer to that question, I want to acknowledge that external costs and benefits, externalities, are a problem, and they do mean that the market process will generate outcomes that are not totally ideal. But let me finish it this way, Richard. There are such terribly severe bad consequences of letting human beings in governments use their power to interfere with people's free choice that we should be very, very cautious giving them that sort of power. Oh, one other thing that this slipped my mind. I should have thought of it sooner. The better general approach than prior restraint government regulation is to define and enforce property rights. And people are, and then use the legal system. So take the take the case here near where you and I live of the Chesapeake Bay, and the very important matter that Joe, this guy you were quoting, talked about, where the farmers they plow their fields and put fertilizer on it, and the runoff goes into the Chesapeake Bay, and we get algae blooms and various environmental problems. Rather than just have the government tell farmers what they may and may not do, another general kind of approach, it's hard, but it has great potential, is to define and enforce property rights. So say you've got somebody, fishermen in say harvesting oysters in the Chesapeake Bay. If you can somehow find a way to give them the right to normally clean Chesapeake Bay water, then they could sue the farmers upstream and say, hey, your runoff is damaging my water and you've got to pay. Now that would be hard to do, but that kind of approach, establishing and enforcing property rights, tends to be, when it can be done, it works better than just giving authority to some human beings in some government agency to tell people what they may and may not do. There's plenty more to be said there, but I'll let that go unless you want to follow it up.
No, that was good. So we've kind of started to talk about regulation, which you talk about a lot in your book. And it's also something I talk a lot about in the law class that I teach. In fact, I tell my students that almost every single activity that we do throughout the day is regulated by the government. For example, when you wake up in the morning, your house hasn't fallen on your head. There's been a builder who had to follow strict building codes. When you brush your teeth in the morning, there are government regulations on the quality of water. There are also regulations on the food you eat throughout the day. There are regulations on the air you breathe, and the list goes on. In fact, when it comes down to it, pretty much the only thing that isn't regulated by government are your own thoughts, which is a crazy thing to think about. But even though there are all these governmental regulations, aren't they good? Aren't they trying to protect the public? I don't want the house to fall on my head. Aren't these government regulations a good thing?
One of the points I make in my book that you've talked about, the free markets, and that I've developed a little bit since writing it, is the marvelous extent to which market forces regulate. For many things, we don't need governments to regulate, because market forces will regulate in their stead. and generally do a better job of it. You've taken the example of building codes. Let's imagine a home builder or a developer that builds homes. If the houses do fall down on the heads of the occupants, they're quite rightly going to sue that developer, that carpenter, and probably put him out of business. And certain builders and carpenters and so on are going to get reputations for quality, and others get reputations for low quality. And that sort of information is passed around in the market. And not just as information, but also a builder or a carpenter probably wants to be a member of a professional association or an association of home builders that has real profit at stake in their high or good reputation. And that sort of interaction in the market, I believe, would be better than government regulation, or as I like to put it, government restriction. To regulate means to make regular and predictable. Governments don't always do that. What governments do is restrict. They say you may not do X, Y, Z, and you must do a KLM. Those are restrictions and mandates. And in a free society, do we really want a lot of those? We certainly want people to be held responsible, held accountable if they're negligent, if they do something that hurts somebody. But you don't need a regulatory agency to do that. You just need a judge. So I'll let it go at that unless you want to follow up on it. I think that we certainly want activities regulated effectively. What's the most effective regulator? A bureaucrat somewhere or the reputation of a professional and the threat of a lawsuit? I don't know. But I believe that it's more likely the market way that's going to give us better regulation than governments. Let me add one other thing, just to get the, we should, it's a real error to think that, well, if the government doesn't regulate, there aren't going to be any standards, there aren't going to be any, and there won't be any regulation. No, markets regulate very, very strictly. Go ahead.
I was going to follow up on that. I think in your book you mentioned that, I don't remember the exact term you used, but there would be potentially private regulatory
certifiers.
Oh, certifiers. Yeah. Okay.
Third-party certifiers. So, if, like, take the home builder case. The some association of home builders or carpenters associations. One example I often give is I can think of the gas station that's down over there a few miles. The one I think it's closest to where we live. They've got this banner on their building that says basically that all our mechanics are ASE certified. That's the American Service and Automotive Service Engineers or something. That's a voluntary organization that provides training courses. And if you pass the training course, they give you a certification that you are trained in working on Greyhound buses or on Mercedeses or whatever. And so that's not government, but that's a kind of regulation. It's a certification. And in the United States, and one of the most important ones in the US is underwriters laboratories. That UL, everybody has seen their emblem, even if we aren't aware of it right now. But underwriters laboratories checks the quality and safety of thousands and thousands of products. They're non-governmental, but I should check. I've said this No, I should ask and try to find out. I wonder if Home Depot even stocks tools, mechanical devices that aren't certified by Underwriters Laboratory, because they're so good. Their reputation is so good that people will just pay extra to make sure that things have been checked out by Underwriters Laboratories. So that's private sector regulation, not mandatory. Richard, if you want to build hand drills and put them on the market with your current state of knowledge as a social science teacher, you should be free to do it, as long as you don't deceive people about what you're selling. But I don't think you're going to sell too many. You would want a certifier to say, hey, this Richard Ireland hand drill is terrific.
Yeah, for sure. Now, switching gears here a little bit, another devil's advocate question. You say that the classical liberal prescription of individual liberty, private ownership, and free markets is the setting in which the poor become wealthier the fastest. What do you mean by this? Wouldn't it be a lot easier to just take money from Bezos and Elon Musk? They have so much money, it's not fair.
Well, let's distinguish. There's do you want me to talk about the fairness question, Richard, or the claim that the material condition of the poor increases the fastest in
Can we split it up? Is that all right?
Yeah, we could take both, but which shall I start with?
Let's do the material condition.
Just look at the data. Look at societies across time and across geography, and rank them as to the freedom of enterprise and protection of private enterprise, and then correlate that against the speed with which the poorest increase in well-being. And I think you'll find that it's in the most economically free countries like Singapore and Hong Kong, though we have to put an asterisk next to poor Hong Kong now, and the United States and Japan and Germany and so on, and compare them to the more restrictive, more socialist countries. And you'll see that while in the socialist countries, the authoritarian countries that don't respect private property, you have a small elite that are extremely valuable, the kleptocracy. Poor people suffer. But where poor people can capitalize their labor and start their own business, maybe pushing a push cart or braiding hair or something, then they go on to other things. They live better. So we don't need to spend too much time on that. My claim is that's an empirical question with a clear answer. The more economically free the region, the more rapidly the standard of living of their poorest people rises. Now you could say, I don't know how well you could do in the United States. Elon Musk and Bill Gates, those guys, they've got a lot of money, but there are a lot of people in the United States. You could take all their money and spread it around to poor people, and I don't think it would amount to a whole lot. What the poor people need, rather than a piece of Bill Gates or Elon Musk's earnings, is the opportunity to use their own talents freely. That'll make more of a difference to them, I think. By the way, on Elon Musk, I do not know the details, so I don't want to be unfair, but I believe that his electric cars have big subsidies through the United States government, and the taxpayers are helping pay for every Tesla. So I don't consider Elon Musk to be a good example of a free market capitalist. I'm afraid he's, at least in certain measure, a crony capitalist, because he's got the backing of the forces in the United States that want electric cars. So when you go to buy one, you're not paying the full price. The taxpayers are paying part of that price. So Elon Musk, not so much. All right, now the other part of that was what?
The fairness question.
To me, fairness is, and this, I should say that when we get to fairness, we're not in economics any longer, we're in political philosophy. And I'm an economist and not a political philosopher, but very interested in the question. Fairness to me, as applied to the money that people have, the wealth people have, is entirely a matter of how they got it. If they got it by stealing, or by big government subsidies to the cars they sell, or the stadiums that their professional sports teams play in, I don't think that's fair. But if they earned it in free and voluntary exchange with others willing to pay, I think it's great. I don't have any problem with it. Take LeBron James, Patrick Mahomes, Beyonce, who are some of the great actors and they're all getting rich. Is that unfair? I don't think so. Stephen Curry is one of my favorites. He's a great basketball player. I love watching the videos. He's just a superb athlete. And I can imagine lots of people willing to pay plenty to watch him pay. And I pay indirectly to watch the videos. Bill Gates, Microsoft, my God, have they ever improved my life? Sergey Brin and Google. Google is wonderful. To a scholar, I can find almost all the world's knowledge easily sitting here at my chair. What he's given me is just, there aren't words to describe it. So I think he got, and most capitalists who work in the market, they have earned what they have by creating wealth, by creating benefits for others. And so I think it's totally fair that they have more than I do. I don't contribute as much to society as Patrick Mahomes does. Let's face it. I like to think I'm a good economics teacher, but people don't really value learning economics the way they value watching he does on the football field.
Can I push on that a little bit?
Sure.
So I think it's easier to make comparisons when looking at, and I'm making an assumption here, I feel like you and I are pretty well off, and then comparing them to millionaires, billionaires. But what about the fairness question compared to people who are dirt poor?
Well, I guess, again, the question would be why? Say, well, those who are wealthy, I've said that I think whether it's fair or not depends on how they got wealthy, why they're wealthy. And with poor people, a lot of the world's poor are so poor as they are because their countries haven't had economic freedom. In the United States, our poor, who are probably above the 50th percentile of the world's population, even people who are poor in America are a heck of a lot better off than most people in the world, at least in terms of their material standard of living. I'm not quite sure what you're getting at, Richard. Are you saying how could it be fair to have the poor people in the terrible housing with the terrible, and the lousy food in the United States, in the poor areas of Appalachia and the big city ghettos and so on? Is that who you're concerned about?
Yeah, that's what I'm pushing on there.
Well, one of the main ways out of poverty is education, right? How well has our government done educating poor people in the cities? It's terrible, just shameful. And then you've got interferences with economic enterprise, such as licensing requirements. In many areas of the country, a poor girl, I guess could be a boy also, but mostly it would be girls who want to do the hair braiding, I guess. They They can't do it legally for pay if they don't have a cosmetology license. So you have lousy schooling that the government provides. You have interference with enterprise, such as occupational licensing that the government imposes on people. You have the drug war, which I think is a terrible thing. I think people should be free to put whatever damn fool thing they want in their bodies. I'm as clean cut as I look, I'm not a drug user, but I think people should be free to do it if they want. And I think if you did not have the drug war, you would not subvert the lives of so many poor people who get drawn into that dead end activity. And the occupational licensing. The other thing, I didn't get into this in my book, and this is one that can be a hot button for people, but I think the war on poverty has been a terrible thing for poor people in the United States. I think the money has been badly spent. The incentives that government welfare and welfare type programs have created have been a problem. So, and I think private charities would do that better. They're very expensive. So I think we have, to sort of sum up, I think we have so many poor people in the United States as we do, because of the obstacles government has put in their way to supporting themselves. And so the two main ones are terrible schooling and occupational licensing, and things like the minimum wage law, which makes it can make it difficult or impossible for a poorly trained, poorly educated person to get a job because he or she doesn't have the skills to earn what the employer would have to pay. So then they don't get a job. So these are all government imposed obstacles to people using their God-given talents and ability to support themselves.
When talking about free market capitalism, especially when comparing capitalism to socialism, communism, Marxism, students like to point out that profit-seeking companies can influence and use government to enrich themselves. And then students say, this is why, or this is one of the reasons why capitalism is bad. First off, are these types of behaviors where businesses and the government are in cahoots with one another part of what capitalism actually is?
Well, it depends on how you define capitalism, right? That's what I call crony capitalism. It's not free market capitalism, in which the government agencies would just be in the business of protecting people's rights and enforcing contracts. But it's a good concern. This is one of the things, this is something that nags at me. I wonder if free market capitalism has in itself the seeds of its own demise. Because when you have free market capitalism, some people are going to be better at satisfying others' wants than others, and they're going to get rich. And people being the ornery, flawed lot that we know them to be, people who get rich are going to try to influence government to benefit themselves. So yeah, that's a problem. The only way I can think of or know to address that is the way the founders tried to do it, by putting limitations on government. The government powers are few and defined. They should be. And as you're a social studies teacher, you probably know better than I do. Gradually, that's been eroded as governments have, with the Commerce Clause and various other ways, have gotten into more and more and more. But in principle, the way to handle that is just to limit what government is allowed to do. If you don't have those limitations, then yeah, I suppose there's always going to be a tendency for capitalism to undermine itself, because the capitalists are going to try to get government interference that benefits themselves. That's a real serious problem. But the solution to that certainly is not to have more government authority from the outset, because then there's that power there to be used to get favors for the government, and that's Putin. He's got all that authority, and he's got his businesses that he supports, and you can't reduce the problem of excessive governmental power by increasing governmental power.
So last question for you. What's the one thing you want students to walk away from an Econ 101, a freshman course, knowing?
I want them to know how the price system works to coordinate the actions of millions in a productive economy. And by the price system, I mean the prices that are generated in conditions of relative freedom. So people are free to buy or not buy as they wish, and businesses are free to offer the products they wish and hire and fire more or less as they wish. If you have market prices in a setting of general freedom of exchange and protection of private property, then those prices are going to help people coordinate with one another to create abundance for one another. That's really the main thing that I want my students to understand, that out of economic freedom emerge market prices that will coordinate the creative activities of all these people in a way that'll benefit pretty much everyone. Is that an answer, Richard? I think that's
good. That was awesome.
Yeah, I think that's what I want them, the main thing I want them to know.
That's awesome. Before we wrap this thing up, I just wanted to plug your book one more time. Again, it's called Free Our Markets, A Citizen's Guide to Essential Economics by Howard Baetjer. I'll put the link in the description. It's an absolutely fantastic book. In fact, I bought it for 2 of my family members for Christmas, and I literally have a list of people on my phone that I want to get the book out to in the future. So definitely check it out. It's awesome. Professor Baetjer, thank you so much for your time. I hope we can do it again sometime.
Richard, I appreciate it. I'd be glad to.